I would like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. The video is going to be informally divided into two sections. The first section is about 10 minutes long, and that will outline the ideas which I have for research grants. There is a sense of urgency because the big grant which I believe this research is highly suitable for has a deadline of December 2014, and we would need to get started working on that immediately as a team because it's an interdisciplinary grant. The grant which I'm looking at is a grant that has been around for, this is its third and final year. I first applied for this grant, attempted to apply for this grant in 2013 and could not find the support that I needed as a graduate student. And so I'm still pursuing it in the third and final year. It's a National Science Foundation grant for interdisciplinary behavior and specifically towards social science research. If the institution where I am hired has already been very engaged in promoting and supporting interdisciplinary research, I believe there's a good chance that the $1 million limit might be somewhere that we could pursue in writing the grant proposal. But otherwise, if it's a fairly new idea, the $250,000 interdisciplinary team exploratory project threshold may be more in keeping with what we should be pursuing. Either way, this video is about introducing you to my research, which I hope to be doing over the next several years, and it is very interdisciplinary. The special evaluation which the National Science Foundation is going to be giving to this, in addition to the intellectual merit and the broader impacts, is that this grant proposal should be it will be evaluated on the interdisciplinarity of the research team, the interdisciplinarity of the research approaches to be used, and the interdisciplinarity of the expected intellectual significance of the research results. And I welcome your assessment of these ideas once you finish watching the entire video, and very seriously I'm interested in pursuing this in the immediate future. My research has evolved around the social equity idea from the very beginning. I returned to university in 2009 for a second career, I guess third career even, and because I was an activist, I wanted to build social equity for marginalized groups. One particular group was where I was focusing most of my effort at the time, and at the encouragement of others, they told me that I needed to learn how to create light, not heat. And so I returned to university for a bachelor's degree in multimedia journalism and communication. Immediately upon graduating from with that degree, I was accepted into the doctoral program in public administration, where I found my true home for this research. And over the years since 2009, when I returned to university, I've been developing ideas toward this very subjective interpretation of the last century and a half in the United States, on whether the discourse, if you will, on the national level has been more leaning towards equality or more leaning toward liberty. Now, I think we can all agree, and once again, this is my own subjective interpretation, so we could argue about this, but my own interpretation says that we have leaned consistently more toward liberty in the United States, and I believe de Tocqueville would also agree with that when he came over here from France. So this line down here mentions and indicates at which points in our history over the past century and a half we have been moving toward equality, this John Rawls equilibrium, if you will, this finding this social equity balance between purely equal and pure liberty. In my research, I have found this significant wrong turn, in my own interpretation once again, in 1968, where we turned downward, back towards liberty and leaving behind social equity. And I think the national discourse throughout the world is fairly consistent in this idea that with Thatcherism and trickle-down economics and Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney in Canada and other world leaders, the trend toward liberty had a very harmful effect on social equity. And so that's what this last era, where it tapers off into the far right side of the diagram shows. Significant in this wrong turn was the Minnowbrook I Conference, which served as the foundational basis of the new public administration, according to Woolridge and Gooden. I specifically follow Susan Gooden very closely on her work for social equity, and it will become obvious why. She mentions 3 books: Toward a New Public Administration by Frank Marini, that was 1971, once again in that wrong turn era that my chart showed. Public Administration in a Time of Turbulence by Dwight Waldo in 1971 as well. And George Frederickson, whose writings in the late 1960s laid the foundation for Minnowbrook I. He wrote, and his most significant book, according to Susan Gooden, was Creating Tomorrow's Public Administration. In Susan Gooden's book that just came out this year, 2014, she writes this: the link between the new public administration and social equity is so strong that Shafritz and Russell defined the new public administration as, quote, an academic advocacy movement for social equity in the performance and delivery of public service. It called for a proactive administrator with a burning desire for social equity to replace the traditional, impersonal, and neutral gun-for-hire bureaucrat. Also very instrumental in Susan Gooden's book, in opening up her book in chapter 1, she writes and quotes Andrew Grant Thompson and John A. Powell, who talk about social structures. They say social structures promote racially inequitable distributions of social, political, and economic goods and services, even in the absence of avowed racists, even absent self-sabotaging behavior by racial minorities, and notwithstanding the play of macroeconomic, cultural, and other large-scale factors. Any promising attempt to dismantle the underpinning of durable racial inequality must account for structural dynamics. And that's where I want to really focus on. These quotes have been all coming toward this idea that there are structural dynamics at play. Important in this work, also indicative of this wrong turn in the late 1960s, is a book by Joan Walsh, which was published in 2012. She writes about, well, and if anybody who follows politics will recognize that in the 1968 and 1972 federal elections, presidential elections, there was a significant turn by the American public toward Richard Nixon. In the 1972 election in specifically, there was this slogan which came out, and I want to focus on this because of how it mobilized bias within the context of that presidential election, with the slogan "Amnesty, Abortion, and Acid." A very fear-inducing slogan, if you will, for people who are hyper-reactive to a certain narrative. And what Joan Walsh highlighted on the back of her book, on the back dust cover, she writes, "It's about our middle class, which so recently flourished, and how it has been injured and diminished almost beyond repair by greed and racist fear-mongering." Remember that drop which I indicated on the last section of the equality versus liberty scale? Joan Walsh notices that as well. As she writes, "Changes in the 1960s pitted Americans against one another politically in new and destructive ways, while economically everyone fell behind except the wealthy." And then this is the most important quote for my research. Right-wing culture warriors blamed the decline on the moral shortcomings of other Americans, blacks, feminists, gays, immigrants, union members. Somebody was to blame. So in this narrative context, what does the phrase "take our country back" really mean? And so we need to get into this. This is where my research wants to get into. My 2 papers at the ASPA conference this year were, I was a Founders Fellow honoree at the conference, and that paper was entitled "Reinventing Community Leadership, a Scalable Organization Development Proposal for Miami's Liberty City." And my second paper was for the LGBT panel, in the Separate and Unequal panel. My title was "Nowhere to Go But Left, Using Narrative Theory to Resuscitate the Moderate Republic and Earn Nationwide Marriage Equality." These 2 papers have one thing in common, and that's why I've made a point of showing how different the titles are, because I need to underscore how both of them rely upon this structural dynamics. Now, Susan Gooden talks about racial equality, but on the LGBT panel, there is a connection in there, and that's where I want to establish this structural dynamics that Andrew Grant Thomas and John A. Powell write about. Something is structural, and that should bring all of these social equity activists together. This diagram here is a paper, is a diagram I did for one of my capstone classes in my PhD program. And this specifically highlights what I found at Liberty City. Liberty City is a historically segregated neighborhood of Miami. MLK Boulevard runs through it, and within a 15-block stretch of this MLK Boulevard, with 5 or 6 blocks on either side of it, there were literally dozens of institutions, whether they were federal, state, county, city, school, or nonprofit. There were just literally dozens of community organizations, and the street-level bureaucrats within these organizations had to report up a hierarchy. Policy making was done at the federal level based on what these people in this silo, if you will, worked toward. What were their goals? What were their ambitions as community organizers, as street-level bureaucrats, and what were their client or citizens' needs? And then the state government worked in a separate silo, and the county government in a separate silo, and the city, and the school, and the nonprofit. So these organizations had all of the power up here in the hierarchy as far as administration goes, and all of the power down here as far as policy making goes. So down here they needed better leadership, up here they needed better information, but these individuals here at the core needed more power. And so this was that structural deficiency where social equity outcomes are made to happen differently for different people, and the disparities and the unequal outcomes are very, very evident on the street in Liberty City. And especially what is disheartening for me, as in my 2-year participant observation research that I was doing on the MLK Boulevard in Liberty City, what was most disheartening was this idea that these individuals could not work efficiently one with another as much as they would have liked to. They really would have loved to have their clients come to one point of contact for all of their needs, whether it was a male with a criminal record trying to work with a parole officer, whether it was a female mother of babies, a mother of small children, a pregnant mother, health needs, the senior citizens, the youth being suspended from school, and all of these forces come to play together at this street level, but every one of these programs are administered in a different silo, if you will, based on this vertical hierarchy. Now, anybody who recognizes that paper would also recognize that the policy making at the bottom and the administration at the top are connected to each other. So rather than thinking of this as a single flat sheet, I need you to think of it as a tube rolled around a paper towel tube, where the policy making and the administration are right next to each other at the end of the day. So where it rolls off the bottom, the arrows scroll off the bottom. What it really does is it rolls back over the top, and we have this continuous loop of authority and decision making and information flow. But what we really need is a crossways communication, a collaborative government, and this is where complexity theory comes in. So this diagram here, if we did a social network analysis of this diagram, what we would find is a fascinating complexity approach to what some are calling complexity governance at this point in time. Now, if we change that diagram just a little bit for the idea of activism rather than community services. Activists are interested in helping vulnerable populations, so I substituted the clients, the consumer, citizen line here with vulnerable population, and I substituted the street level bureaucrat line with activists or volunteers. And so the same diagram works. It's all, this one is fairly much focused downward on policy making, whereas the previous one was fairly much focused upward on administration. Activists and volunteers want to make things better on a policy level, and community organizers want to make things better at an administrative level. So this diagram works well for both of my research questions, which I'm coming to now. The research questions which I have are meant to tie the importance of this research together at a higher level than others have previously been able to do. Research question number 1 asks, can street-level bureaucrats and community workers in the inner city break free from their hierarchical structures to generate a single intergovernmental and interinstitutional point of contact for the diverse needs of their at-risk population? Research question number 2 asks, can a tiny PFLAG group, now PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, so can a tiny PFLAG group who meet around a dining room table in one of Utah's homogeneous suburban communities have a measurable impact on state policy decisions and thereby gain important rights and protections for their vulnerable children and friends? So when we think of these 2 research questions as it relates to these 2 diagrams for authority, power, or information flow, question number 1 relates to this one here, which has the street-level bureaucrats on it, and question number 2 relates to this one here, which has the activists or the volunteers on it. But either way, they need more power, and that's what this the entire dissertation is about, is highlighting and underscoring a mechanism whereby the power that is currently being housed up here in the hierarchy might be diffused a little bit so that the street-level individuals and the activists have a little bit more power as it relates to the administration and as it relates to policy making. So that's really what this whole paper is about at this point in time. Now, with the 2 research questions set out, the true scale of this research becomes more evident, because what will work in the inner city in America and what will work in the tiny PFLAG group in suburban Utah will work anywhere in the world. The institution that is being proposed out of this research is truly an institution with global outreach. It's the reach of this technology and the information communication technology that will be proposed in this video will be possible in some of the most remote parts of the world through mobile technology. So in 2011, when Time magazine named the protester the Person of the Year, that year culminated on the weekend of November 12th with 951 cities holding almost simultaneous protests in 82 different countries. And that was when I started my dissertation. That was when I started in the PhD program, and the ideas for my dissertation started to germinate around that. So the important thing in this research for you to understand is that protest narratives are not governing narratives. What works at disruption is absolutely not suitable in any way for governing. And so some mechanism needs to be put into place, and that's what this dissertation and this grant proposal are all about. So in the context of what Grant Thomas and Powell put together in their idea about structural dynamics, when you think about that, what structural dynamics are at the heart of the inability of the activists in these 951 cities to convert their protest narratives into governing narratives? In particular, the Occupy protesters would hold circle time every day at 3 o'clock. That was part of their MO, to have this policy-making discussion every day at 3 o'clock, where ideas from these sometimes hyper-educated young people would come out and they would put them into circle time and then they would blog about them. But as a researcher, I had to find Occupy Oakland and Occupy Auckland, New Zealand, and Occupy Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada, and in Europe, and specifically Greece and Spain and Italy and Portugal. Their narratives that were coming out of this were very different, and they were hard to research because it was across languages and it was across cultures. So the structural dynamics that were creating this demand for a protest and this need for disruption are still there. Nothing was fixed because for the most part, very little policy change came about as a result of that. So this is a wicked problem. The wicked problem is multifaceted, but what I really want to focus on here is the idea that it was group-centered. The Occupy movement, the Arab Spring movement, and in Brazil there's the Movimento Passe Livre, which is the Free Fair movement, which started the protests there in 2013. So the research and the funding goals, which I have here, is centered around these activist-oriented groups. What could I give to them? What technology is there? Especially as it relates to information communication technology that would give them sustainability, number one, but also train them in how to be better social equity activists and how to be better street-level bureaucrats, and what are the tools that would be common to all of these needs. And that's where we're going to go with this. In order to have more power at this level here, where the street-level bureaucrats and the activists and the organizers and the citizens and the vulnerable population are, what could we give them here that would give them more power, that would devolve the power down out of the hierarchies and legitimize it at this level here? And also the other question comes up is, if this power in the hierarchies is being used with the structural deficiencies that Grant Thomas and Powell talk about, is it illegitimate power? Is it legitimate power up here if there are vulnerable populations down here that are being marginalized by an abuse of this power? And so these social equity outcomes tell us that something is wrong here, because the public services and goods are not being equally distributed. We have a social equity, disparate outcomes in social equity. So that's what this research is about. Over the past 3 years, I've spent a great deal of time trying to figure out how to operationalize my research and what kind of a model I could put together to talk about this issue. So my dependent variable, a very long time ago, came out. I decided upon the effectiveness of a social equity activist to be my dependent variable. What can I do? What can be done in order to improve the effectiveness of a social equity activist? As an independent variable, when you think of a marginalized group or a vulnerable population, the power to mobilize bias is it's the first thing that comes to mind across the board, as far as inner city individuals go, as far as the PFLAG group in suburban Utah goes, as far as the protesters on the street, the unemployed, 30% unemployment in Spain and high unemployment in Greece, and the devaluation of currency in Argentina, and the inability of the government in Brazil to meet the needs of the most vulnerable population. All of this comes about, when you think about it, the lack of policy change happens and we'll get into this in great detail, as a result of somebody casting some group as undeserving or deviant. So we're going to talk about the social construction of bias. The intervening variables, which I have in here, X2 and X3, have to do with the legitimacy of power and the functionality of representative democracy. And we're going to unpack this now. This is where we're going to go. But before I do that, I want to go through the grant a little more in detail. I've already talked about the National Science Foundation grant, where there's either $1 million or $250,000 available, depending upon how the research grant is put together. The deadline is, of course, December 2nd this year, and this is the last year that this particular grant will be made available. But there's also many grants that would follow in 2015. The Economic Development Administration grants are coming out. This is just an example of one. Because and I will show this and explain this, how this grant opportunity here comes out. The National Endowment for the Arts has several grants for the digital, for the Challenge America Fast Track grants for 2015. The Small Business Administration, when you think about economic opportunities in the inner city and in other marginalized areas of the world, there are several Small Business Administration grants that are possible. The National Endowment for the Humanities for the past year has been focusing on the digital humanities, and that is certainly a part of what this grant opportunity is talking about, this research is talking about here for subsequent years, particularly into 2015 and beyond. There's also just literally dozens and dozens of postdoctoral research fellowships that are available through the National Science Foundation when you talk about the social behavior and economic sciences and how the interdisciplinary nature of this project could fund several postdoctoral research fellowships. And now we can actually get into, if you're short on time, then you can stop watching at this point. But what I really want to get into now is the granular detail that I talked about earlier. In order to operationalize this research, I've had to use proxies, which are far more easily measured. When you talk about the power to mobilize bias as the independent variable, it's such a subjective term, and what I wanted to do is I wanted to put a proxy in there. So I put a proxy in there called the degree of worldview threat that a particular community feels. And I'll get into how this is operationalized, but when you think about a religious community, what is it that, number one, what is it that would create a worldview threat for them, for this religious community, and how severely will they react to that worldview threat? And the degree of reactivity to that worldview threat is very, it can be quantified. And once it is quantifiable, then you can determine what kind of a reaction you're going to get out of this group. Because if you're going to make a social equity activist more effective, you have to train them in how to deal with populations that react strongly to a worldview threat. And I'm going to get into that. The proxy number 2, proxy for X2 as an intervening variable, what I've substituted in for the perceived legitimacy of power is the tangible and emotional cost of shunning. What does it cost somebody in a community to be shunned or excommunicated or eliminated? Is it a tangible cost? Is it financial? Is it physical? Or is it emotional? And so that is also a degree of, there's a degree of reactivity in there that can be measured as well. And that will impact the effectiveness of a social equity activist as well. And the intervening variable, the functionality of representative democracy, is something which is tangential to these other 2 variables here, but it can also be quantified, and it's already something which political science is very good at measuring. So operationalizing these 2 tables here and moving from there's an inductive sequence which I want to build now as we move from X1 to proxy X1, and as we move from X2 to proxy X2. And that inductive sequence now is where we're going to focus the rest of this video. And we start with 6 hypotheses. These 6 hypotheses we're going to deal with every one of them step by step, but this is the interdisciplinary nature of this grant. This is why this grant is so perfect. That's why this research is so perfectly suited for the National Science Foundation Interdisciplinary Grant in the social sciences and behavioral sciences. Because as you go through these sequences, this inductive sequence, you'll see how many arenas of academic disciplines are touched upon, and how many of them are actually areas where we need to dig very deep into areas. But beyond how interdisciplinary it is absolutely indisputable that public administration, and especially public administration in light of how it's focused on social equity, becomes the lead discipline for this grant. Public administration deals with translating services and provision of public services and goods to the public. And when public administration fails, social equity is lost. And also it allows certain populations to be more effective in marginalizing another population, especially vulnerable populations. So let's get on to the end project here. The end objective, at the end of the day, of course, is to answer Schatzsnyder's question, where he says the most legitimate question to be asked in a democracy is how can people get control of government? And so those are the very last 2 points of the 6th hypothesis here on redefining how representative democracy works. So we are going to end up with an idea of how to win elections and how to bring about transformational policy change. And so those 2 points, of course, are a long ways down the road at this point in time. So let's just get started here. The whole idea for this research project is built upon the foundation that bias is socially constructed. Schneider and Ingram in 1993 talked about the 4 quadrants of social of bias, and how some are cast as undeserving and how some are cast as deviant. And if you cast somebody in society, if somebody is cast as undeserving or deviant, then society gets to wash their hands of them. We don't have to worry about them in public administration, because we've done what we can, but they, quote unquote they, have determined to not be deserving or to be deviant and operate outside of the social norms. So there are expectations which we require in public administration before somebody gets help. And if they are undeserving or deviant, then we wash our hands of them. We don't have to give them that kind of help. And so socially constructing bias against these kinds of individuals and marking them as such, undeserving or deviant, is behind a lot of what is a problem in social equity formulas. That's what makes them wicked problems. So unpacking question number 1, if we look at a street level bureaucrat and a community worker in the inner city? How can we make them more effective in providing equitable access to public goods and services? We have to look at the brokers of power. Remember, we're working on our model here, our research model, without the proxies. So who is it that has the power to mobilize bias against inner city populations? And is that power a legitimate power? Are the current brokers of power in possession of that power through a legitimate means? That becomes our primary focus here, is this legitimacy of power. But also we have to identify who they are. Because remember, we're talking about improving the effectiveness of the social equity activist or the street level bureaucrat or the community organizer, in this case in the inner city. And so we have to help that person identify who the brokers of power are, and we also have to make sure that they can expose illegitimate power, if that is indeed the case. And then also we need to work on improving the representative nature of democracy for this inner city population. So those are the intervening and independent variables that we're going to talk about as it relates to research question number 1. Research question number 2 about the tiny PFLAG group who meet around a dining room table in one of Utah's homogeneous suburban communities. Once again, who are the brokers of power that are casting this population as deviant? When we're in the inner city question, unpacking question number 1, remember, that is cast as an undeserving population. The social construction of bias has been cast as an undeserving population when it relates to the inner city. When it relates to the PFLAG group, the gay teenager, they have been socially, the bias there has been socially constructed in such a way that they are a deviant population. So who was the broker, power broker, who created that or had that power to mobilize bias in the first place? And number 2, is that legitimate power again? And number 3, representative democracy, especially in a state like Utah, where roughly 58% of the population at the state level is Mormon. The representative nature of democracy for the gay teenager is seriously stacked against them, because when 50% plus 1 vote controls the state house, the state legislature, and the state House of Representatives and the Senate, then the needs and to be fair and equitable treatment, the fair and equitable treatment of a gay teenager is really out of the hands of that group. So what can we do to help them? And is that power legitimate when it is worked, when it is operationalized in that manner? So the power that mobilizes bias, we're going to argue here, is illegitimate power. And we're also going to argue that the American state legislatures can be hotbeds of illegitimate power. When I was talking to a libertarian friend of mine, somebody who I met through research that we were both doing, he mentioned that his ideal objective would be to dissolve either federal government or state government, one or the other. We didn't need both. And that got me thinking, you know, what would the political landscape in the United States look like if we dissolved state power? The state legislature could still be there because we still have so many mechanisms where the state legislatures need to operate. But if we devolved the power downward to the local level, what would it look like? So what does a veto-proof majority, when we look at this table here, the one where we've unified this power across the middle, where street-level bureaucrats, activists, and organizers have become unified and collaborative, and a mechanism has been provided for them to be very collaborative in a complex governing system. And we're also, citizen participation is also functional, and that we've devolved power down out of the State House and also to a certain degree away from mayors and elected city commissioners. So what does a veto-proof majority in a state legislature create as it relates to this model? Well, what it does, especially if it's in a Dillon rule state, what it does is it completely takes away power from local government and from local groups. So the idea to have more power at this level here means we have to figure out a mechanism to delegitimize power up here when it has been used and as a state-sanctioned mechanism for marginalizing a vulnerable population. And we have to devolve that down to here, but we have to legitimize this power in order to delegitimize this power, and so that's really where this is going. Now, if we turn back to 1960s and the Minnowbrook I conference, H. George Frederickson, who participated in the Minnowbrook I believe, wrote that it is a time for public administrators to ask the so-called second question. For whom is this program effective or good? So the first question is, well, we're going to provide the public provision of goods and services. And that is a responsibility of public administration. That's the first question. How do we provide those services efficiently and effectively? And then we need to ask the second question, for whom? And when we look at this diagram here, if it is only for a dominant group, if the provision of public goods and services are really only fair to a dominant group and a minority group or a vulnerable group is not participating equitably in that provision of public goods and services, especially as it relates to a gay teenager in Utah or an inner city individual attending a substandard school, then we've answered that second question, for whom is this program effective or good? Well, we know who it's not effective or good for. Dr. Ferozmand, Ali Ferozmand, also wrote about this third period, which was the third period of public administration when government was doing great things. And why was it allowed to change? He talks about how we lost that and how we need to go back home to this period when government did great things. So let's talk about all of these 6 hypotheses at this point in time. H1, the first hypothesis asks, states that the power to mobilize bias can be traced to a narrative community, sometimes centuries old, that has created its own sustaining institution around an ostensive view of said narrative that both defines and protects the hierarchical authority of said sustaining institution. Now, really quickly, we're just going to touch on, we've already touched on the mobilization of bias, but we need to define a narrative community and a sustaining institution here. If we look at this diagram here, which is also explaining the ostensive view versus a performative view of narratives, these narrative communities can be seen as a population that subscribes to a certain narrative, and Mona Baker defined this, and I've got that in my dissertation. But a narrative community requires a sustaining institution. If the narrative is provided as an interpretive monopoly, where it can only be interpreted one way, they've defined a worldview. And as long as you abide by that worldview, you belong to the in-group and you get to stay in this sustaining institution, and the narrative is protected by this mechanism of maintaining affiliation. But if you violate the narrative, you're cast into this out-group. And the out-group has to search for another narrative community. So in the case of being gay, so if we take our research question number 2 here, being gay as a lifestyle choice has historically been the narrative that allows the gay community to be cast as deviant, because the heteronormative behavior has defined heterosexuality as acceptable and moral behavior. And people who choose a gay lifestyle are choosing an immoral or amoral lifestyle. And so they become deviant from the norm, and they can be cast out. And so they have been othered in this by this narrative community. Now, anybody within this narrative community that wants to go on the record as defending the rights of gay and lesbian individuals has violated this narrative community, and the sustaining institution has a mechanism in place to throw them out. So they become part of this out-group because they started to believe that people are born gay. And so that idea, that belief as a performative narrative, is threatening to the worldview of this ostensive view. The ostensive view can be thought of as setting the table for guests. If you set the table at 1 o'clock and the guests are arriving at 6 o'clock, you can set the table, leave the room, and you come back and the table has been set. That's an ostensive view, because once it's in place, it's always going to remain in place. So the narrative here that being gay is a lifestyle choice was set in place centuries ago, and it's seen ostensibly by this narrative community as something that has just always been in place, like when you set the table. But from a performative view, as soon as you stop performing that narrative, it ceases to exist. So as soon as this worldview, if we can erode this worldview somehow, then more and more people are going to either depart willingly or be thrown out of this narrative community, and this narrative community will become smaller and smaller and smaller, and this narrative community, with its performative view, becomes bigger and bigger. So this has a diverse membership, and pluralism is embraced by this community over here, and pluralism is threatening to this community over here. This also works to privatize conflict, which is an idea that Schatzsnyder put forth as far as policy making goes. If this is a religious community, then this narrative is protected by the First Amendment. And so this is that narrative is used to privatize the conflict. This says we cannot socialize this conflict because that would violate my religious freedom. My religion is protected by the First Amendment, so we cannot have a public debate about whether or not being gay is a lifestyle choice or not, because my religious beliefs are protected by the First Amendment. So that effectively privatizes this conflict and says, it prevents it from gaining traction as a socialized narrative, as the socialization of this conflict, where we can have a public debate about it, an informed public debate. And so that threatening nature of the performative view of this narrative is cut off from a policy-making standpoint, because the narrative community over here is claiming religious freedom to continue to spread this bias and to continue to mobilize bias against the LGBT community. So the hierarchical authority is also very important in this sustaining institution here, because without hierarchical authority, there would be no mechanism available to throw out those people who violate the narrative internal to this sustaining institution. You have to be able to shun or excommunicate these individuals before this narrative can be protected, because without that mechanism without that threat to these individuals, there's no consequence to violating the narrative within this community. And so the hierarchical authority has to be there. And so Frederick Thayer knew, when he condemned hierarchy with his book in 1973, End of Hierarchy, End of Competition, Frederick Thayer knew that representative democracy would almost have to be dismantled along with it, which is why he wrote about an almost infinite number of small groups. So we're going to come back to Frederick Thayer later, but hierarchical authority is the capstone, so to speak, of the first hypothesis. The second hypothesis states that the perceived legitimacy, and that's perceived legitimacy, it's an important word, the perceived legitimacy of the authority described by H1 is embedded in the narrative in such a way that any who dare challenge that legitimacy from within the narrative community can be purged by way of an internal mobilization of bias, typically shunning it, communicating, or public shaming. So as we look about the sequence of H2, going from the understanding of power, whether it's legitimate or not, to the ability to actually delegitimize power by exposing tangible and intangible costs when a person is shunned, then we've got a better understanding of terror management theory. Max Weber, in his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, talked about how not even God, the Protestant work ethic was kind of this loophole that allowed people to say they can be rich and still get into heaven, because God likes people who work and take initiative and are self-motivated. And then on the flip side of that is God won't reward lazy people because he actually considers them to be undeserving. So this is the idea of how you can cast people as undeserving, because if they don't work according to the narrative community here, which is the Protestant work ethic narrative community, then God himself doesn't even love them, and he's not going to reward them. Maybe he'll love them, but he's certainly not going to reward them. And so lazy people who aren't going to be rewarded by God certainly don't have to be rewarded by public administration and the provision of public goods and services. And so that's where this terror management theory kicks in here, is that there's this mechanism where it's in the words of Sandstrom and Carlson, that it's an incredibly efficient homogeneous policy network, this sustaining institution is, because it has this ability to plug structural holes. And plugging structural holes means anybody who violates the narrative can be shunned, excommunicated, and they will also experience eternal consequences. So it's almost like being able to extort obedience out of the members of this narrative community. If you want to belong to this narrative community, you have to abide by this belief system, or in this case here, the narrative is, you have to work hard. And if you don't work hard, then you aren't deserving of public goods, public services, and or even God's love and God's rewards in heaven. And that's where this terror management theory comes in. The third hypothesis states that by interpreting hegemony as a broadly defined sustaining institution and hegemonic narratives as the mechanism through which the hegemon have retained power over the centuries, it can be shown that marginalized people in many ways consent to their own oppression by obedience to socially constructed narratives. thereby becoming complicit in further legitimizing the perceived authority described by H2. So the sequence of H3 is that we have hegemonic narratives. Pluralism is a threat to these hegemonic narratives, which triggers the zero-sum thinking and just war mentality. And we also need to teach the social equity entrepreneur or activist how to teach people that they are consenting to their own oppression in many ways. And then we have to be able to end the complicity. So if we think about this threat of pluralism, just to get into that a little bit deeper, culture and tradition, when pluralism is equated to anomie, or in other words, a normless society, it triggers a just war mentality in the religious. So women are homemakers. This is, women are homemakers as an interpretive monopoly is a narrative community by itself. Okay, so the dotted line represents that narrative community. And the sustaining institution in this case is culture and tradition. And in that culture and tradition, which is in many ways the hegemonic narrative, that has stated over the centuries that women who don't know their place and become feminists and radical thinking individuals, that's seen as a gateway drug kind of to the normless society. So if we are that liberal, if we allow our women to be that liberal, then we've opened up this door to a normless society, and that triggers a mentality, a just war mentality. Abortion, a woman's right to choose, or a pro-life position, as countered to a pro-life position. So a pro-choice position as opposed to a pro-life position, that is seen as a zero-sum game. That is seen in zero-sum terms, because if we allow women to have abortions, then that is that opening that door to this normless society where murder is engaged in willfully by women, and so we have to dictate laws in place that regulate women's behavior even in the privacy of an appointment with their doctor. And so that's how this anomie kicks into, is brought in as a threat. That's how anomie as pluralism becomes a threat to these sustaining institutions, to these narrative communities who have to have an interpretive monopoly in order to exist. And that's how the narratives are enforced, and women are thrown out of such narrative communities if they violate the culture and tradition historically. Zero-sum thinking and just war mentality is something that I really experienced when I was doing my participant observation research in Liberty City in Miami. The idea, I called it a three-legged stool, because I found that if I could knock any one of these three legs out from under the stool, then I opened up a dialogue to pluralism. I opened up an idea that, you know what, maybe there are structural flaws in the system where we actually have institutionalized racism taking place and in evidence. The idea that the Civil Rights Movement the Civil Rights Act of 1964 took something from white people is a narrative which Joan Walsh talked about. The idea that if blacks gained any new rights, well, or call them new rights, if blacks had equal access to the public goods and services of society itself, that means that somehow, some way, there were less public goods and services available to white people who had historically enjoyed a privileged position, where they were the only ones that got VA loans, they were the only ones that got free tuition after World War II. And so this zero-sum thinking is a mechanism that protects the sustaining institutions of white privilege. A just war mentality is also in place here. A good example of a just war mentality was in Oklahoma, where the Black Wall Street area of a city was burned to the ground over one minor little thing, but it had been building for a while, to the point that the riots, when the riots started, the riots just went totally out of control because they had fostered this idea of a just war mentality, and the entire section of the black section of the city was burned to the ground. And it was a very prosperous section Historically, as a nation, it was one of the most prosperous black communities in the United States. And the other idea, the third leg of that stool, is complicity. If people who enjoy white privilege don't have to do anything to continue to enjoy it. All they have to do is block change. And so the idea that white privilege will continue if you do nothing. Maybe you're not going to be an activist. Maybe you didn't participate in the riots that burned down Black Wall Street section. But if you knew somebody who led that and didn't turn them in, complicity is what allowed the Holocaust. If you've been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you've seen 3 floors of that museum dedicated to how complicity allowed the genocide of Jewish populations of Europe. The idea that you consent to be oppressed is one of the things which Antonio Gramsci wrote about when he was in jail. Workers may come, and Marx wrote about it as well. This is Denhart writes about Marx when he writes, workers may come to believe that their work should contribute to the accumulation of private property by others whom they may see as more fortunate and even more deserving. The idea that I was born into this station of life, so I need to be happy in my station in life, is part of a hegemonic narrative. That's what you're supposed to think, and you're supposed to be happy to be, that your labor is, that you've got the job. Be grateful for your job, even though you know that your labor is contributing 3 or 4 or 5 times the value that you're getting paid to the net worth of your boss. You're supposed to be happy with that, and that's what the hegemonic narratives tell you. You're supposed to consent to your own oppression. And we see this in many, many examples, and that's part of this third hypothesis. And once again, we're back to this idea of the privatization of conflict. Who's hiding behind the cross in American politics? The contract with America in the 1990s was a classic case of, in my opinion, it was a classic case of where hegemonic narratives told Christians that if you vote with us, we will protect you by stopping all change, where you could lose Christian privilege, where you could lose white privilege. So this privatization of conflict, by saying that this is a religious right that you're protecting, makes the fact that that behavior is marginalizing a deviant or an undeserving person or a population more palatable. It takes socialization of that conflict off the table because you can't interfere with the religious freedoms of a certain population. So if you cast the narrative in such a way that this marginalization is happening as a result of religious beliefs, and that religious beliefs are the dominant beliefs in America, then you've privatized that conflict, and you're saying, no, we can't have government change this policy because that would infringe on my religious rights. So who's hiding behind this cross? Because Christianity is the dominant narrative, the dominant community in the United States. How much Christian privilege is there that is actually marginalizing to another vulnerable population? So this power of non-decision is something that Bachrach and Baratz talked about in 1962. When we stop change, this power of stopping a policy change is a very real power. So who benefits more than Christian fundamentalists when change is stalled out, or by this incrementalism, which is just so maddening to certain populations who have experienced centuries of marginalization? So ending the complicity is something which we want to look at here. I've done a diagram here which I won't go into in detail, but it's at this point we've identified, what I've tried to do is show on this diagram a heterogeneous policy network on one side, which is primarily the Democratic side of a political spectrum, and a homogeneous policy network exists on the Republican side or the conservative side. And what we look at here is the reaction to worldview threats is very heavy on this homogeneous side, where the homogeneous policy networks exist. Homogeneous networks, as described by Sandstrom and Carlson, are incredibly efficient. You can pass policy really, really quick, or you can prevent policy change very easily, because everybody is singing from the same hymn book. And they're very reactionary to a worldview threat, so all you have to do to mobilize the bias is say, oh, this is a worldview threat, and these people will jump up and they will react very strongly, and they'll show up in the primary elections, and they'll show up at the federal elections, and they will show up at state elections and city elections and school board elections, because the narrative was that this is a threat to your worldview, this is a threat to your narrative community, and the sustaining institutions of these narrative communities are very, very efficient, and they're very, very effective in getting the population excited about this threat that exists here. Once again, pluralism is a threat to the narrative communities here. Now, when it comes to H4, it states that given H1 to H3 and an understanding that sustaining institutions that enforce ostensive views of narratives have been engineered to generate strong reactions to perceived worldview threats, it follows that a given narrative that defines who the undeserving and deviant are might be displaced far more easily than it could be deconstructed. This is where we get into discourse structuration, which is an important principle from Hugh Miller in his book Governing Narratives. When there's a worldview that is, in many cases, centuries old, you can't deconstruct it. The narrative communities have their sustaining institutions in place for precisely this reason, to prevent the deconstruction of those narratives, and also to protect how they are an interpretive monopoly. So the idea of discourse structuration coming into here brings in just a plethora of interdisciplinary work, because it brings in media theory and sociology and social psychology. It brings in technology and all of the tools which can be used in displacing narratives rather than deconstructing them. So we're going to go on the idea here. My research builds on the idea that you cannot deconstruct. You would be unsuccessful as an activist if you tried to deconstruct these age-old, centuries-old narratives because of these sustaining institutions. In doing this and to facilitate the displacement of these narratives, media will have to be thought of in a completely different way, and technology, which has been instrumental in changing how media is disseminated, is going to play, in my opinion, a very central role in how to do this. This diagram here is from my published works. My very first published paper came from a conference that I attended on information communication technology, and this diagram and this idea came together as far as a mechanism whereby these disparate activist groups, who are all trying to build and improve social equity, are going about it in a way where they almost see each other as competitors. And so in order to give these groups sustainability, number one, and to give their discourse structuration a helping hand so that from across the globe all of these narratives might be archived in a central institutional memory, this idea came together. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on it here, because there are videos on my webpage at www.moxie.com, which is MOCSIE.com. These videos are out there based on my conference that I did in Guimarães, Portugal, and the paper that was published in the International Journal for Information Communication Technology and Human Development. This is all technology. This literally would take a couple of $100,000 to build this database in the way that it has been engineered with the search algorithms. Notice down here it has the sustaining institutions. It talks about the narrative communities. And this is on the policy campaign side of things, which is the bottom half of this institutional memory. On the top half of this institutional memory, it talks about the media campaigns. The media is divided into 6 broad, all-encompassing categories. The policy campaigns are encompassed in 6 all-encompassing campaigns, policy campaigns. So this is how that mechanism works. There's drill-down mechanisms in this database, so that as crowdsourced material is put in, it can also be retrieved using these search algorithms, which will build narrative threads, and that's the way it's been engineered. So once again, that's years of research ahead of that coming down the pipeline as well. But it all starts with a database which is already being developed. I've had a graduate student helping me compile this database language and help me code it. But what it's about at the end of H4 here, if you follow it across, it's about creating an engineered emergent narrative community. Finding this shared premise. Because we have dialectic narrative communities, this one here is an ostensive view, this one here is a performative view, as we've seen earlier. The only way around this worldview threat, which is coming across based on pluralism versus the interpretive monopoly, the only way around it is out the bottom, by creating this new emergent narrative community. And how to germinate that emergent narrative community based on a shared premise is very important in my research. Important part of that is contact hypothesis. My son is a social psychology PhD student at University of Arizona in Tucson, and he's been working with me and helping me a great deal in understanding how contact hypothesis might work based on media, on technology, enhancing that. My husband is African American, and so we got thinking how contact hypothesis might work with our mothers, who were both born in the 1920s. And when you look at the theory of social psychology, there's 6 conditions now. Gordon Alpert talked about 4, but Aronson, Wilson, and Aker talk about 6 conditions for social psychology now. And my husband and I got thinking about how our mothers might have, how we might have been able to engineer contact between our mothers. And really what we built upon was the idea that even if they had lived in the same town, would they have ever discovered what they had in common? What they did have in common was that their favorite flower was the lilac, and they both had a gay son. So what would have brought them together? And we came to the conclusion that there was very little that would have brought them together because of these social structures, this structural racism and institutional racism that has vulcanized the United States between whites and blacks. And so the idea that media theory might be able to enhance the opportunities for social psychology to work has been embedded into this technology in the 6 media campaigns, so that individuals who are searching for similar narrative threads might also pull out of that this contact hypothesis, opportunities for contact hypothesis to be engineered through the media theory. And so with that in place, the idea that their favorite flower was the lilac may have been enough, and the fact that they did have 2 gay sons, they each had a gay son, this idea may have been enough for them to build on. If all that you need is just this cracking, you need to open the door a crack, and social psychology can be made to work, especially if it's engineered into the information communication technology that's being made possible today. So the 5th hypothesis states that social equity activists seeking to improve the human condition for marginalized populations by displacing the narratives that define the outgroups as undeserving or deviant will need their own consensus-building narrative communities and sustaining institutions before they can succeed in creating compelling emergent narrative communities that embrace diversity and pluralism. This is where the technology came into play, and this is how my conference was. This is how my paper was accepted for not only the conference in Guimarães, Portugal, but also in Prague, in the Czech Republic. The information communication technology, the information systems, have been engineered in such a way that they would be non-hierarchical. Many prominent academics have been advocating for decades now that we get off of this dependency on hierarchical institutions. Ali Farazman, my dissertation chair, talks about how public governance in the past 3 decades has been characterized by this organizational eclecticism. And so what he wants to do, and what he writes about in this article here, where he talks about, can we go home? Meaning, can we go back to the time when government did great things? What Ali Farazman says is that in the process of trying out everything, experiments have been conducted, some with success while others with failure, leading to a proliferation of eclectic choices, many unsuited for organizational effectiveness but beneficial to powerful interest groups and politicians, all at the expense of alternative organizational choices and broad-based public interests. 3 broad theoretical models and periods are examined, and so this is what that 3rd period that he talks about is when government did great things, and can we go back to that? And we need to look at non-hierarchical organizational structures as part of that, because we haven't been able to develop it if we've left the hierarchy in place, which is what Frederick Thayer says. So the idea of training social equity activists now enters into the picture, into my research at this stage of this fifth hypothesis. I've used the model of bell hooks as my juggler, and I call this position the social equity activist a juggler, primarily because I'm looking for somebody who is different than the angry, in-your-face protester as the social equity activist. I am one of those people. I am. When I get out there and when I'm on a picket line and when I write a blog and when I post things to my Facebook wall, it comes across as angry. I am, because I have been a victim of marginalization. When I react to that, there are triggers which create a reaction in me which is unsuitable. And so I could be trained. With proper training, I would be far more effective as an activist. And so somebody like bell hooks, who I've used as my model here, needs to be seen as this juggling model of somebody who keeps out and in play 6 different ideas that have to be they have to be balls that are in the air all at the same time, and that's why this juggler metaphor is so perfect for me. This person has to be able to build consensus. This person has to be able to claim legitimate power. And all of this is part of the training, and how to keep these 6 objects in the air all at the same time is very, very critical to this stage of my research. The mechanism put in place to do that, which is non-hierarchical, comes from this model which I built using the Second Life gaming platform, for lack of any other suitable technology at this point in time. When we started putting together the idea of a cloud resident institutional memory, it naturally followed out of that we also have a cloud resident institution that was a virtual institution built in the metaverse, where there's no geographical boundaries, where there's no political boundaries, and where there is complete and total freedom to get out from under a hierarchy if one develops. And so this completely free association that's possible in the metaverse became a perfect platform from which I organized the idea of a virtual university where these jugglers could be trained. And also what came out of that was the idea that it could also be self-funding. If it's modeled, my first career in accounting also saw me working on franchise development. So as an accountant and entrepreneur, I helped people build franchise models. And so I saw this as a mechanism that could also be built upon a franchise model as long as it stayed away from hierarchy. And so I found researchers at the ISIS 2012 conference. There was a pre-conference hosted by the Journal for Virtual Worlds Research, in which I met Dr. Yisha Sivan, the managing editor for the journal. And his research has talked about 3D, 3C. Now 3D we understand being three-dimensional, which is part of that three-dimensional virtual world that we can create now, where you actually build an avatar and you are interacting through your avatar with other real-life people who also have avatars. So that's the three-dimensional element of it. But Dr. Sivan also argues that we need to create a community, and we need to create a platform for creativity, artistic creativity, entrepreneurship, where you build businesses and where you actually come out with some commerce. We know from the Facebook model and the Google model that and the Twitter model on the internet with technology, if you have a high traffic web domain, you have an audience, and if you have an audience, you have a revenue stream. And so this is where the idea becomes very viable as self-funding. And my accounting background for 25 years in entrepreneurship tells me that this model could be monetized with high traffic and with a community unto itself. And commerce would very much be a part of that through an Amazon type of shopping network, even if you wanted to buy within your network, if you wanted to consume each other's media, then this traffic on the web domain becomes something unto itself, and it would become self-funding if the mechanisms are built into place for that. Which brings us to the 6th hypothesis. And once again, all of this material is very thoroughly researched, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of pages about this. And even my dissertation is not going to touch on all of this material that has been thoroughly researched and has been the subject of many conference presentations. So the sixth hypothesis states that given H5 and recognizing Schatznyder's idea that the goal of democracy is to get control of the government, if the sustaining institutions for progressive groups were able to form an effective and efficient heterogeneous governing institution capable of both organizing politically and advancing compelling viable policy proposals, then a model for truly representative democracy will have been discovered. So we don't have to abandon representative democracy if we can create these heterogeneous networks, and if we can also find a way to create these infinite number of linked groups. Now, the heterogeneous policy networks, I've introduced you to this diagram of the American political spectrum earlier, but the heterogeneous policy network fits over here primarily on the progressive side of the political spectrum. The homogeneous policy networks benefit by blocking change, so it's suitable that they be called conservatives. But over here on the heterogeneous policy side, we've got all of these group-based special interest campaigns going on all the time. The social equity campaigners are talking about gay and lesbian issues, they're talking about economic development issues, alternative energy, improving democratic systems, women's rights, environmental activism, universal health care, social security, the labor unions, world peace, global poverty. All of these are part and parcel of these heterogeneous policy networks. And really, when you take it up one level and look at it as who is the vulnerable population that you are trying to protect, or what is the mechanism that is being used to marginalize these populations, then you arise to that level where it is the mobilization of bias. And when you look at what is behind the mobilization of bias, then you end up with the research model, which I've got. We're going to return to that shortly. But it was, once again, Frederick Thayer who talked about these infinite number of small groups. In 1973, Frederick Thayer had no idea how he would link them, and he even said so. So he knew who had to sit in on these small group consensus building meetings. And consensus building was the operative word there. He saw in his research that most of the most decisions were made as part of a group of 5 or 6 individuals. And if you look at the models which I put together earlier here, it is based on 5 or 6 individuals working together in small groups that are linked. And that mechanism of that virtual institution, which I show here, has as its foundation, if you look at the group which, this 3D3C model which I used for the ISIS 2012 pre-conference event where I presented my paper, there is a group over here which is the green circle about operations. This group here, the red circle, is about the media campaigns. The blue circle is about the policy campaigns. And the linking circle, which is the administration and the decision-making core. And the person in the middle, the black icon in the middle there, is the juggler, which I'm talking about. So this is where we're getting to now that we're on the 6th hypothesis, is creating this virtual institution. And there's only 10 layers shown here, but in the metaverse there is absolutely no limit on how many layers deep this may be. And in the November 11th and 12th, on the weekend of November 11th and 12th in 2011, there were 951 cities in 82 different countries who had mounted a simultaneous protest movement. And if they would have been all linked together, if they would have had one single institutional memory, which is part of the 5th hypothesis, then they would have had something which I argue would have created sustainability. And this is where complexity theory gets into play, and it becomes a very difficult area of this research for me to advance through unless we get into the ideas of complexity governance. Because this model here will only be, it can only be analyzed by looking at complexity governance. So it's about winning elections. This is the final 2 points of the 6th hypothesis. The most legitimate question to be asked in democracy is, how can people get control of the government? Well, as this inductive sequence argues, if you have the proper training and if you have a sustainable institution developed that is non-hierarchical, that is based on consensus building models, and that has all of these other little elements of the 6th hypotheses through this inductive sequence, then you may very well have a mechanism that would be perfectly suited for winning elections. But let's look at the idea of what may come out of this. If you look at the traditional political paradigm in the United States, and elsewhere probably, you end up on the progressive side of things, which is the left. The new economy progressives are out there, and big government left, and the ideas for socialism are out here as well. But we're just going to look at the idea that, you know, a big government left and the new economy progressives are here on this model. We have the political moderates in the middle, and over on the current political right, the way we see it, as the conservatives, which is a misnomer really, we have the small government libertarians and the religious right, which is an uncomfortable relationship on the best day. But if we consider that the spectrum moves more conservative as it goes to the right and more progressive as it moves to the left, what do we end up with as everybody tries to move away from traditional government? So if the old ideas of government have now become unpopular, people don't want to move back to traditional government, but they want to keep moving to a more progressive direction, and they want to keep moving to a more conservative direction. And we've seen this polarization of politics throughout the world. And the driving force, if we look at this as a curve, then we have a driving force bringing two forces politically, two potential forces, potentially bringing two political forces together again. This idea is that they don't want to go back to traditional government, but they do keep moving away from traditional government model. But if they come around the backside and they meet again, then we've got a new continuum. And the argument is for the idea that we can, as the New Economy Coalition, as the New Economy Progressives, put together a proposal for the small government libertarians and say, you know what, let's create a collective government. And this would be very attractive, I believe, to pragmatic libertarians who see that as long as it's not traditional government, then it's worth having a look at it. And it could create a new political moderate middle that is absolutely distance itself from traditional government, but still could attract a moderate middle electorate on the idea of collective government that is self-sustaining, self-administering, and very efficient and very effective. And so if this new kind of a coalition can be formed over here, then there is a new political continuum that we could see as a continuing circle, with traditional government serving in its role, but with a collective government also serving in its role. And this is where that power would devolve away from the state government in my modeling here for the United States. So the dependent variable, once again, our final look at it, we created a mechanism for transformational policy change. The argument is that the effectiveness of a social equity activist or a street level bureaucrat is based upon three traits here, which I've identified. They're motivated and they're trained, and trained in ways to recognize the mechanisms through which illegitimate power is claimed and abused, and they're also trained in a way to legitimize their own power. And that's what they've done here, is we've devolved the power away from the hierarchies in these 6 silos, and we've unified a collaborative force here. And because of this unification, society itself, the citizenry, would recognize it as having legitimate power, because it has pulled away, and because it shows that it's effective, that it shows that it's efficient as well. And so if you put that power here, then all of a sudden with the power here, the power drives policy making on this side, and in many ways the street level bureaucrats and the activists will drive behavior in the administration as well. And so this is where I argue transformational policy change can come from. And once again, this is complexity governance. This, if you put the social network if you put the SNA, social network analysis, to work here to find out, then the research could show where this devolution of power away from the hierarchy and into the street level bureaucrats and into the citizenry. And this is where that argument for collaborative governance comes from, collective government. So the social equity goal, once again, is this John Rawls equilibrium, and the emergent narrative communities that I've talked about are all going to be aimed at improving and moving back up towards this equilibrium in the middle. So these emergent narratives would say, you know what, we are not being fair. What we are doing is marginalizing to certain populations, and these populations that have previously been cast as deviant and undeserving are not deviant and undeserving populations, they are just different. So we would embrace diversity, and we would be able to move through these emergent narratives back towards a social equity goal of equilibrium. And once again, this mechanism has accounted for the structural dynamics by looking at the power to mobilize bias, by looking at the legitimacy of that power, and by looking at how effective representative government is, then we will have improved the effectiveness of a social equity activist, because we looked at these structural dynamics that Grant Thomas and Powell talked about. And once again, this virtual institution is the answer to those structural dynamics. And if we had that in place, one has to ask, and well, I have to ask myself, if this would have been in place in 2011, when we had tens of thousands, literally hundreds of thousands, and possibly millions of people in the street blogging and posting to Facebook, and if there would have been some kind of technology in place to give that institution, to create one single institution with one single institutional memory, would have that been enough to bring all of those individuals together for a new kind of global governance? And my argument is, and the research which I propose to do over the next several years hopes to show that. Now, as it relates to the grant, returning back to the topic and concluding on this point, whether it's the $1 million grant proposal or the $250,000 grant proposal would depend upon how existing teams that have already got some kind of history in interdisciplinary research can be put together. If existing teams are already well established, I believe it's very feasible. It could be going. We could be going for the larger block of funding. But just to recapture what we would be doing as far as this research goes and how interdisciplinary it would be. Remember, my mechanism for operationalizing this research was to get the proxies in place so that the research would be more easily operationalized. The power to mobilize bias is very subjective, and so this degree of worldview threat is, in my opinion, a very good proxy for it, because it can be easily quantified. If there is no reactivity to a worldview threat, the power to mobilize bias almost evaporates. And especially when you're talking about the two kinds of bias which this research deals with. The social construction of bias, where a population is deemed as undeserving or deviant, either one of those two things. So where there is a worldview threat, there is an incredible ease on the part of powerful individuals to mobilize bias just by leveraging that worldview threat. And where that worldview threat is most effective is where there is perceived legitimacy to the degree that individuals can be shunned and eliminated or excommunicated or pushed out of their community, regardless of where, and especially where there is a high cost, either tangible or emotional, to those individuals as a result of the shunning. And the functionality of representative democracy is something that can be analyzed in connection to X1 and X2. And all of them have this negative correlation to effectiveness of social equity activists. So as the degree of worldview threat is minimized by creating an emergent narrative community, if you can displace the narratives that marginalize individuals and entire populations with new emergent narratives, then the effectiveness of the social equity activist goes up, because the worldview threat has been diminished. We've allowed them to have a new kind of a narrative that embraces diversity, that talks about pluralism in positive ways rather than threatening ways. And the narratives which would allow people to see through the illegitimate power, because if you talk to individuals and say, why are you shunning people in your community just because they think differently from you? You are shunning your own brothers and sisters. You are shunning your parents. You have allowed the excommunication from your church to hurt you emotionally because you have failed to look at these issues through another lens. How about we talk about these in different ways? That's the emergent narrative community. So the cost of shunning, the cost of excommunication, and the ability of these sustaining institutions to marginalize their own through the internal mobilization of bias is greatly diminished, and therefore the effectiveness of a social equity activist goes up as well. And where the X1 and X2 are diminished, functionality of representative democracy is also improved. But we're also looking at mechanisms of improving representative direct democracy mechanisms through these small consensus building groups. So if we can create new direct democracy tools as collaborative government, as collective governance comes in to play through new technology, then the functionality of representative democracy also will improve, and the effectiveness of the social equity activists will improve. So this is the new research model with proxies, and this is how it would be operationalized. And once again, we have a training syllabus essentially right here. I would argue that it's actually a certification program for social equity activists. It can be done in any number of languages now because of technology on the internet. If it's a 100% web-based curriculum that people can take on the domain that would also be shared with the institutional memory and the governing mechanisms for this representative democracy, then social equity activists, for a very, very small fee, or even for free with proper funding from foundations, social equity activists could certify and become self-certified through these training modules, where their skills can be developed through multiple disciplines in social psychology, linguistic anthropology, technology, the use of technology, the use of media, the sociology, and just innumerable other courses which span multiple disciplines. But if they can all be brought together to improve the effectiveness of social equity activists, then that's the goal of this research project here. Thank you for your time. Any feedback, positive, negative, or otherwise, is more than welcome. I encourage you to please send it to me. And my email address is available at the webpage, www.moxie.com, where many other videos and papers have also been accumulated as it relates to this research.